The literary world has recently commemorated the 10th anniversary of the death of one of France's greatest 20th century writers, François Mauriac. The state funeral that he was accorded in September 1970 and the many moving tributes that were paid to him by readers and critics throughout the world were a fitting testimony to the esteem in which he was held by all.
François Mauriac owes his unique place in 20th century French literature to several factors. First, to the quality and the quantity of his creative writing. Over 100 published works, including 23 novels, 5 plays, 4 collections of poems, numerous essays, critical studies, as well as countless newspaper articles.
This creative writing, by its richness and its variety, has earned François Mauriac a host of readers in many countries, as well as France's highest honours and distinctions. In 1925, he was awarded the Grand Prix du Roman for his novel Le Désert de l'Amour, The Desert of Love. In 1932, he was elected president of the Société des Gens de Lettres. In 1933, he became a member of the French Academy, l'Académie Française, and then in May 1952 of the Académie des Sciences, Lettres et Arts of Bordeaux. More recently, he was promoted to the highest rank in the Legion of Honor, that of Grand Croix.
However, his fame was not restricted to France itself. Other nations honored him as well. In the United States, he was elected a member of the Academy of Arts and Letters. In England, he received an honorary doctorate from Oxford University. Finally, in 1952, he was awarded the supreme accolade, the Nobel Prize for Literature.
There is, however, another area in which François Mauriac exerted an enormous influence, the field of political journalism, and this too has helped to earn him his unique place in 20th century French literature. Throughout his career, he contributed regularly to a large number of reviews and newspapers, and he even founded and edited several of them. After making his literary debut in several small publications, now defunct, in the Bordeaux area, he transferred his activities to Paris in 1908 and became the secretary of the recently established Revue Montalembert.
He then progressed to other journals, which welcomed him with enthusiasm. Les Marches de l'Est, La Plume Politique et Littéraire, La Revue des Poètes, even the prestigious Revue Hebdomadaire and La Revue du Temps Présent, in which his first collection of poems, Les Mains Jointes, was published in 1909.
After the First World War, François Mauriac continued to contribute regularly to the leading literary journals, among others the Nouvelle Revue Française and Écrit Nouveau, later to his own review, Vigile. But gradually his interests moved towards politics, and his signature was soon seen regularly at the foot of leading articles in the main Paris newspapers, Le Gaulois, L'Écho de Paris, Le Figaro, with which he was to remain until 1955, Sept, and Temps Présent.
During the German occupation in World War II, Mauriac continued his political writing in the clandestine publication Les Lettres Françaises, as well as in foreign newspapers. Then, immediately following the liberation of Paris in 1944, he made a dramatic reappearance in the first issue of the Free France Figaro with his famous article on Général de Gaulle, Le Premier des Nôtres.
From this point on, he devoted himself more and more to what he called his second career, that of a political journalist, and each week thousands of readers in France eagerly awaited his commentary on current events and issues of every kind, which he published under the title of Bloc-Notes, notepad, first in the journal La Table Ronde, where he'd begun his column as early as 1949, then between 1954 and 1961 in the Paris newspaper L'Express, and finally right to his death in 1970 in Le Figaro littéraire.
Because of his prodigious activity in these two spheres, creative writing and political journalism, François Mauriac attracted a vast audience made up not only of admirers but also of detractors.
However, even those with whom he'd clashed acknowledged his undisputed talents. The author André Gide, with whom he'd had a sort of love-hate relationship throughout their lives, when asked who was, in his view, France's greatest living writer, was quick to answer, Mauriac, hélas.
François Mauriac was born in Bordeaux in 1885 and was the youngest of 5 children. Before he was 2 years old, there occurred the first major event in his life. His father died.
In a radio interview broadcast in 1952, he describes, in the husky voice that was the legacy of a serious throat operation some 20 years before, the effect of this event on him.
Mon enfance m'apparaît comme un monde si confus et si fourmillant qu'il m'est très
My childhood appears to me now as a world so confused and so full that it is difficult for me to recall precise memories. But the thing that dominates it is the death of my father. My father, whom I did not get to know, since I was only 18 months old when he left us. But when I reached the age of reasoning, it seems that I was already a prey to this great emotion. The presence of this departed one, when, for instance, my mother opened her wardrobe, was one of my earliest memories. The sight of my father's hat, which he had kept, and which was there, lying on piles of linen, the sight of this dead man's hat.
From the age of 5, François Mauriac attended a kindergarten run by nuns who, as he later said, were probably very good women, but certainly not very tender. 2 years later, he was sent to a college of the Marianist order, and there he spent what seemed to him interminably long days, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evenings.
This was not a particularly happy period of his life. He was teased by the other pupils because of his puny appearance and his drooping eyelid, the result of an early childhood accident.
J'étais un enfant, non pas maladif, mais un peu chétif. Je m'étais blessé la paupière en jouant avec un de mes frères, ce qui me donnait un aspect...
I was not a sickly child, but a rather puny one. I had injured my eyelid while playing with one of my brothers, which gave me a rather unpleasant appearance. That is, as a result, I had one eye larger than the other. In short, I was not one of those charming curly-headed children who are generally at the top of the class in the infant school. I was, in a word, very unhappy, or very unhappy.
The young François Mauriac was, however, much happier during the holidays, which he generally spent at the family property in the tiny village of Saint-Symphorien in the Bordeaux land. There he played with his brothers and his cousins, explored the pine forests, and revelled in the country atmosphere that was later to be so vividly described in his literary works.
He received his first communion in 1896, a date which he later referred to as une date éternelle, a never-to-be-forgotten date. Then followed a period of serious study at the Collège Lebrun in the outskirts of Bordeaux, a period during which he made his first contact with the French classical authors who were to influence his later work, in particular Pascal and Racine. It was, too, a period marked by his early successes at French composition, a subject in which he regularly topped his class. François Mauriac, the writer, was already headed for his future career. It was then, in fact, that he wrote his first short novel, Va-t'en, Off You Go, dedicated to his sister Germaine.
After passing his baccalaureate at the Collège Lebrun, François Mauriac completed his licence ès lettres at the University of Bordeaux. Then, in September 1906, headed for Paris to enroll in one of France's grandes écoles, where archivists and librarians are trained, l'École des Chartes. His stay there was a short one, however, and he soon resigned in order to play a more active part in the Paris literary circles to which he had just been admitted. He frequented the leading salons of the day, met the already established writers, and saw his first articles and poems appear in print.
In 1910, the highly respected author and critic Maurice Barrès, in a glowing article published in one of the leading Paris newspapers, L'Écho de Paris, hailed the young Mauriac as a poet in the truest sense of the word. Your future will be easy and glorious, he predicted in a letter to his new discovery. François Mauriac's name was made.
In 1913, there occurred what François Mauriac described as the most important event in his life. He married a young lady from Bordeaux, Jeanne Lafont. Her father at first refused to allow her to be seen with this unemployed young poet. As Madame Mauriac recently recalled,
alors le 5 août, mon mari était voir mon père, et qui était très aimable, mais qui a dit qu'il refusait, qu'il ne voulait pas qu'il m'épouse. Alors donc, en principe, je ne devais pas le voir.
Then, on the 5th of August, my husband went to see my father, who, though very pleasant, refused to allow me to marry him. So, in principle, I was not to see him. Finally, on the 5th of November, my father saw François and allowed him to meet me.
The wedding took place the following year, and the couple settled into Paris, returning regularly to Bordeaux for their holidays at Saint-Symphorien or the Mauriac family estate, Malagar. Then came the First World War, which saw François Mauriac serving as a stretcher-bearer at Salonika, before being invalided home following a severe bout of malaria.
The next few years were a period of intense literary activity, as novels, essays, critical works and articles appeared at regular intervals, and Mauriac's reputation as a writer grew. Further successes followed, and the first official honors were bestowed on him.
Throughout these years, he combined his career as a full-time, now well-established writer with his life as a family man, the father of 4 young children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. His eldest son, Claude, now also a writer and critic, recalls his childhood within the family circle. In answer to the question, "Was your father strict?" he has this to say.
Not at all. He was not strict so long as he was left in peace at home and allowed to work. No, not at all strict. Even as far as religion was concerned, even from that point of view, he was really quite liberal-minded. Of course, we had to go to Mass, but that was all.
For François Mauriac, however, work was sacred, and the children were never allowed into his upstairs study, his retreat, his cagibi.
C'était comme ça, vous savez, il était rue de la Pompe, vous voyez, un escalier qui montait dans une petite chambre de jeunes, dans son cagibi, vous voyez, l'escalier là, oui. Et là, il travaillait là, personne ne montait, jamais, moi, mon fils rentre là-dedans tout le temps, il est
That staircase led to a small maid's room, his retreat, and there he worked. Nobody ever went up there.
In 1932, disaster struck the family. François Mauriac found it difficult to speak and was found to be suffering from a cancer of the throat. His vocal cords were removed, but after a long convalescence he fully recovered, the only legacy of his operation being his husky voice, which he sometimes used to great effect. It was during this convalescence that he discovered the music of Mozart, which was to become one of the passions of his later life.
This troubled period gave way to a much happier one, marked by Mauriac's election to the French Academy and further literary triumphs. But then came the war, the German occupation, the sudden curtailment of almost all literary activity, the intellectual resistance.
During the years that followed, Mauriac the novelist was for a time eclipsed by Mauriac the journalist and political writer, as he became deeply involved in his country's successive crises, the Moroccan affair, the Algerian War, the internal political turmoil leading to the recall of General de Gaulle as President of the Republic. François Mauriac, in fact, remained throughout his life one of the staunchest supporters of de Gaulle, and many of his articles, as well as one of his most successful books, were devoted to the general.
But shortly before his death, François Mauriac returned once more to the novel with an adolescent d'autrefois, an adolescent of yesteryear. He was in the process of writing a sequel to it, Maltaverne, when he died in Paris in September 1970, at the age of 85, mourned by friends and former foes alike, and hailed by all as one of the leading figures on the French literary scene throughout the century.
General de Gaulle himself, in a letter delivered to François Mauriac's widow on the day of Mauriac's death, paid him this tribute.
Quant à moi, je lui voue une reconnaissance extrême pour m'avoir si souvent enchanté, pour être un des plus beaux fleurons de la couronne de notre pays, pour m'avoir honoré et aidé dans mon effort national de son ardente adhésion, de sa généreuse amitié, de son immuable fidélité. Ce concours m'aura été sans prix. For my part, I owe him my extreme gratitude for having so often enchanted me, for being one of the finest gems of our country's crown, for having honored and helped me in my national task with his ardent support, his generous friendship, his unshakable fidelity. This assistance has been priceless for me.
François Mauriac's literary work was dominated by two great influences, his native Bordeaux and his Catholicism. The first enabled him to bring out to the full the simplicity and the complexity of French provincial life. The second earned for him the title of one of France's leading Catholic writers.
Mauriac's novels fall into three clearly defined groups. The first comprises the early works, L'Enfant chargé de chaînes, Young Man in Chains, and La Robe Prétexte, published just before the First World War, and La Chair et le Sang, Flesh and Blood, which appeared soon after it. They portray youthful souls, Jean-Paul Joannet, the country school pupil, Jacques, a stormy adolescent, a character revealing the influence of Mauriac's mentor, Barrès, and Claude, May, and Edouard, three young people who cannot reconcile their social differences.
All these works reveal the author's hesitations as a Catholic confronted by religious doubts and worldly ambitions. In conformity with Catholic teaching, Mauriac was expected to represent all earthly love as antagonistic to the love of God. As a young man, he strove to reconcile the two, but not always with complete success.
After his next novel, Préséance, Questions of Precedence, 1922, which serves as a kind of transition, a novel in which he paints an unkind picture of French provincial life in the Bordeaux region, Mauriac emerged from the troubled, adolescent groping characteristic of his earlier work with Le Baiser au lépreux, The Kiss to the Leper, 1922. There begins a second group, a series of infinitely more mature and skillfully composed novels. Le Fleuve de Feu, The River of Fire, 1923, Génitrix, also 1923, Le Désert de l'Amour, The Desert of Love, 1925, Thérèse d'Esquerou, 1927, Destin, Destinies, 1928, and Ce qui était perdu, That which was lost, 1930. In this group, the psychological crisis, so characteristic of French classical theatre, is expressed in its most refined form.
The third group, beginning with Le Nœud de Vipère, The Viper's Tangle, 1932, and comprising Le Mystère Frontenac, The Frontenac Mystery, 1933, La Fin de la Nuit, The End of the Night, 1934, Les Anges Noirs, The Dark Angels, 1936, and Les Chemins de la Mer, The Unknown Sea, 1939, are the work of the middle-aged Mauriac, where the psychological study is sometimes subordinated to other elements. The same tendency is evident in his later novels, La Pharisienne, A Woman of the Pharisees, 1941, Le Sagouin, The Little Misery, 1951, Galigaï, The Loved and the Unloved, 1952, L'Agneau, The Lamb, 1954, as well as in his last completed work, An Adolescent d'autrefois, An Adolescent of Yesteryear, 1969.
The combined efforts of the novelist, psychologist, and Catholic writer are seen at their best in Mauriac's portrayal of characters. They're divided into those central figures whose psychology is the special object of his study, and the minor characters who serve as motivators. Among the lesser figures are representatives of all classes of provincial society. Mauriac satirizes some of them, his satire often being directed towards those followers of the Church whose particular brand of religion consists of an over-strict adherence to prescribed dogma. Janine, the old man's granddaughter in Le Nœud de Vipère, is a typical example.
Mauriac is equally pitiless towards the complacent bourgeois, whose main aim is wealth and comfort. He likewise attacks the tyrannical middle-class family with its narrow-minded bigotry, its attempts to control the private lives of its individual members, and its censorship of any independence. The father-in-law of the young widow Noémie in Le Baiser au lépreux, for instance, leaves his fortune to her on condition that she never remarry.
But it's above all when he's describing the main characters and the situations in which they find themselves that Mauriac's mastery of the psychological crisis is seen to best advantage. Le baiser au lépreux, The Kiss to the Leper, for example, is the story of the physical and mental suffering endured by a young man with a misshapen body. He's described at various stages of the novel as cloporte, woodlouse, petit mâle noir et apeuré, small, dark, frightened male, larve, grub, and grillon éperdu, bewildered cricket. On the morning after his wedding night, he is plus hideux qu'un ver, more hideous than a worm, and becomes finally un triste faune, a sorry fawn.
This creature, Jean Pelluer, is sickly, ugly, timid, and rich. He marries an attractive young girl, Noémie, and tortured by a feeling of inferiority, he avoids her as much as possible and deliberately exposes himself to death in order to rid her of his presence.
An equally tense struggle takes place within the mind of his young wife, Noémie. She faithfully serves cette larve qui est son destin, this grub that is her destiny, during his lifetime, and after his death refuses the attentions of a handsome young doctor in order to remain faithful to the memory of her husband.
Finally, as Noémie also dies, the love that could not be achieved here on earth is realized in the next life.
Another striking example of the psychological crisis is found in the novel Génitrix. In it, Mauriac describes the excessive, almost tyrannical love of an old woman, Félicité Cazenave, for her son Fernand. When he marries a young woman, Mathilde, a conflict immediately arises. Mathilde criticizes her husband's foibles, gets up in the night to open the windows, aggravates Fernand's rheumatism, and makes fun of his family. Soon Fernand returns to his childhood bed in his former room next to that of his mother. Mathilde dies for want of care during a miscarriage. Madame Cazenave has triumphed. But her victory is short-lived, for Fernand leaves her and returns to the bed of his dead wife.
There then begins a renewed struggle between mother and son, in which Fernand, tortured, fights at once against his living mother and the ever-increasing influence of his dead wife. But finally, Madame Cazenave also dies, and Fernand is left alone, unable to cope with the loneliness that he now experiences.
Among the many fine passages in the novel, none is more moving than this one, where Fernand, in paying his respects to his wife Mathilde, who's just died, discovers in her a beauty and a serenity that had completely escaped his notice during her lifetime.
Oui, il faisait une étrange tête. Enveloppé dans sa robe sombre, la nuque au dossier du Voltaire, il regardait fixement Mathilde. Un verre d'Armagnac, qu'il avait déjà vidé et rempli, était sur le guéridon. Des papillons de nuit voletaient autour des deux cierges, cognaient au plafond leur ombre. Un moment, il prononça le nom de Mathilde, et sa mère n'aurait pas reconnu cette voix. Il se levait, s'approchait du lit, chassait une mouche, contemplait cette beauté éternelle. Il se répétait en soi-même, aveugle, aveugle.
Probably François Mauriac's best-known novel, if not his best, is Thérèse d'Esquerroux, written in 1927. It is also a story of a psychological crisis and of a family tragedy, but of a different kind.
Thérèse d'Esquerroux spends her life in the provinces near Bordeaux with a pompous, indifferent husband, Bernard, until she finally gets the idea of poisoning him by gradually increasing the doses of arsenic that have been prescribed for him by the doctor to treat an illness from which he is suffering. The doctor becomes suspicious of Bernard's symptoms and reports Thérèse to the authorities. She is tried but acquitted on the favorable evidence both of the doctor and of her husband, who wish to protect the family's name.
But after her return home following the trial, she's condemned to a life of seclusion and loneliness, shut in her room, where even her meals are brought to her, allowed out only on Sundays to go to Mass with her husband, so that she would be seen with him. Finally, Bernard takes her to Paris and decides to allow her to remain there, a free woman. But it's too late for her to cope with her newly found freedom, and she's left wandering aimlessly around the streets of the capital.
Mauriac was to write 2 short sequels to his novel, Thérèse chez le docteur, Thérèse and the Doctor, and Thérèse à l'hôtel, Thérèse at the hotel in 1933, and a longer novel, La fin de la nuit, The End of the Night in 1935, thus completing the cycle and rounding off his portrait of Thérèse.
In writing Thérèse d'Esquerroux, Mauriac used various techniques that were relatively new at the time, such as the inner monologue and the flashback, showing Thérèse's childhood and her gradual transformation from an innocent young girl to a would-be killer plotting her husband's death.
Thérèse d'Esquerroux has proved to be Mauriac's best-selling novel, helped no doubt by a very successful film adaptation made in 1962 and starring Emmanuelle Riva in the role of Thérèse.
Here is Emmanuelle Riva reading the passage where Thérèse describes her first encounter with a young man, Jean Azevedo, whom she meets while out walking alone during her pregnancy soon after her marriage. A young adventurer, he is the exact opposite to the stodgy Bernard whom she's married.
Je ne désirais rien alors. J'allais 1 heure sur la route, parce qu'une femme enceinte doit marcher un peu. Que mon ventre était lourd. J'aspirais à m'asseoir sur le banc pourri de la palombière. Comme j'en ouvrais la porte, un jeune homme sortit, tête nue. Je reconnus au premier regard Jean Azevedo. Et d'abord, imaginez que je troublais un rendez-vous, tant son visage montrait de confusion. Mais je voulus en vain prendre le large. C'était étrange qu'il ne songeât qu'à me retenir. Mais non, entrez, madame, je vous jure que vous ne me dérangez pas du tout. Je fus étonné qu'il n'y eût personne dans la...
Almost as well known as Thérèse d'Esquerroux, and probably the finest example of Mauriac's analytical method, is Le Nœud de Vipère, The Viper's Tangle, written in 1932. It's the story of a man who's grown old without experiencing the love that has always been his secret craving. He remains until the end, shut up in solitude.
He hates his wife and children, thinks that their one aim is to spy on him and rob him, and his one aim is to frustrate them. Even in his old age, he admits that his heart is saturated with poison. As he puts it, a viper's tangle that it is impossible to untangle, and that can only be broken by a stroke of the knife or the sword, and coup de couteau, and coup de glaive. He sums up his sorry state in these words.
Écoute, Isa, tu découvriras après ma mort dans mes papiers mes dernières volontés. Elles datent des mois qui ont suivi la mort de Marie lorsque j'étais malade et que tu t'inquiétais à cause des enfants. Tu y trouveras une profession de foi conçue à peu près en ces termes. Si j'accepte, au moment de mourir, le ministère d'un prêtre, je proteste d'avance en pleine lucidité contre l'abus qu'on aura fait de mon affaiblissement intellectuel et physique pour obtenir de moi ce que ma raison réprouve.
However, on his deathbed he relents, and after distributing his wealth, he dies in peace. Because Mauriac's sinners repent and redress their lives, he earned the title of one of France's leading Catholic novelists, a title that he didn't always accept, for he maintained that there is often a conflict when a writer is at once a Catholic and a novelist.
François Mauriac, the novelist, has another great merit. His style is marked by vivid descriptions, which give atmosphere to his stories. In the opening scene of Le Baiser aux Lépreux, for instance, he depicts the absolute silence that prevails in the home of the hypochondriac, where even the door hinges have been kept oiled. In Genitrix, each creak and crack of the old house emphasizes the empty loneliness of the lives of its inhabitants.
In Le Nœud de Vipère, an old man is just about to accede to his wife's wish that he give up the idea of his threatened departure, when, in crossing the terrace, he notices a semicircle of chairs and strewn cigarette butts, mute evidence of a family war council from which he's been excluded.
Mauriac interprets traits of character and emotion by physical peculiarities and habits. Maria Cross lies on a sofa with a book that she never finishes. Thérèse is perpetually smoking cigarettes. Bernard's fingernails are never clean.
For brevity, that preeminent virtue, Mauriac set new standards. Within the confines of a short story, he was able to concentrate the essence of a whole novel. However, he's not a writer to be read lightly or swiftly. His highly charged style demands the closest attention. He displaces phrases and adverbs to avoid monotony and rigid exposition, and in doing so, gives his style the charm of poetry.
For François Mauriac was, in all his work, essentially a poet.
Ce que je puis dire, c'est que j'ai d'abord été poète, et que mes premières tentatives de prose ont été certainement une recherche du poète en moi à s'exprimer. Et je crois que le romancier est né peu à peu du désir de fixer et d'exprimer toutes ces découvertes, presque inconscientes, puis-je dire, que j'avais fait en étant un petit garçon observateur et attentif.
What I can say is that I was first of all a poet, and that my first prose efforts were certainly an attempt by the poet in me to express himself. And I believe that the novelist in me was gradually born of the desire to fix and put down in writing all these almost unconscious discoveries that I had made as a young observant and attentive boy.
Mauriac the poet is nowhere more master of his art than in his collection entitled Le sang d'Attis, The Blood of Attis, composed in 1940, in which he recreates the Greek legend of Attis and Cybele. In the following short extract from one of the poems in this collection, Cantique de Cybele, Cybele's Song of Praise, the goddess of the earth, Cybele, expresses her love for the young shepherd Attis, the god of vegetation, whom she's found abandoned in the reeds.
Vous m'avez possédé avant votre venue. Vos 1000 précurseurs ont foulé mes chemins. Les ronces de mon cœur griffaient leurs jambes nues, et mes branchages fous faisaient saigner leurs mains. Ils ont frayé la route, ils ont coupé les branches, Attis, pour que tes pieds ne fussent pas blessés. Mais savaient-ils que tu venais, toi, leur revanche, m'arracher plus de pleurs qu'ils n'en avaient versé?
François Mauriac, the novelist, playwright, poet and journalist, is well known. Mauriac the critic and historian is much less so. One of his most ambitious undertakings was the life of Jesus, Vie de Jésus, written in 1936. In it we find the same qualities as in his other works, and in particular the moving simplicity of his style. Here, for example, are the opening lines of the passage in which he describes the betrayal of Jesus in the Garden of the Gethsemane.
Voici le moment d'entrer dans la nuit. Quand il aura franchi ce seuil, sa passion commencera. Il récite l'Allel, qui est l'action de grâce pascale, et pousse la porte. Il descend, contourne le temple que la lune de Pâques éclaire, atteint un enclos au bas du mont des Oliviers. La petite troupe, depuis que Jésus est traqué, dort souvent dans ce jardin, appelé Gethsémani, parce qu'il s'y trouve un pressoir pour les olives. C'était le refuge habituel lorsqu'il ne poussait pas jusqu'à Béthanie.
These same qualities are to be found again in a work of a very different kind, Mauriac's Black Book, Le Cahier Noir, published clandestinely in 1943 during the German occupation under the pseudonym of Forez. In it, he appealed to his fellow countrymen not to give up the fight. Above all, he said, they must have faith in mankind.
Eh bien non, nous croyons en l'homme. Nous croyons, avec tous nos moralistes, que l'homme peut être convaincu et persuadé. Même ces bourgeois qui enfouissent des cassettes dans leur massif de bégonia, oui, même ces intermédiaires pour la vente de toutes denrées consommables, nous croyons qu'ils ferment les yeux et peut-être qu'ils serrent les poings, place de la Concorde, devant ces drapeaux, je ne les ai jamais vus qu'à travers une brume de larmes, ces drapeaux où la croix gammée ressemble à une araignée repue, gonflée de sang.
As a literary critic and historian, François Mauriac has made an equally important contribution. His studies of Pascal, Rousseau, Flaubert, Loti and Barrès are among the most authoritative that have been written. One of the most detailed and widely acclaimed is that devoted to Racine, written in 1928.
Mauriac was himself for many years reluctant to write for the theatre, as he didn't consider himself to be a good playwright. He often regretted that he didn't have a suitable director to guide and advise him. He found one finally in his friend Édouard Bourdet and wrote 5 plays: Asmodée, 1937, Les Mal-Aimés, 1945, Passage du Malin, 1948, Le Feu sur la Terre, 1951, and Le Pain Vivant, 1955. Although not generally classed among Mauriac's greatest works, they nevertheless occupy a worthy place in 20th century theatre. Because of their simple structure, the Racinian style in which they're written, and the conflict of passions depicted in them, they're often quoted as striking examples of modern French classicism.
In Les Mal-Aimés, one of the main characters, Monsieur de Virolade, cannot reconcile himself to the fact that his daughter Elisabeth will one day leave him in order to get married.
Monsieur de Virolade, se refuse à la pensée que sa fille aînée, Élisabeth, puisse un jour lui échapper en se mariant.
Toi qui as peur la nuit, Élisabeth, je suis sûr que tu m'approuves. Il faut se débarrasser d'un chien qui n'aboie pas. À quoi penses-tu, ma fille? Tu dors debout?
Qu'y avait-il dans le tiroir?
Quel tiroir? Ah oui, celui que Marianne a ouvert. Écoute, nous nous sommes séparés d'elle que par une porte. Elle risque de nous entendre et puis j'ai soif. Nous serons mieux chez moi pour causer.
Je n'ai plus envie de causer, père. Je n'en ai plus le courage.
François Mauriac, in the 10 years that have elapsed since his death, hasn't lingered in the literary purgatory from which so many writers do not emerge. On the contrary, he is probably the 20th century author who's best survived.
There are many striking proofs of Mauriac's continued presence. First, he is still widely read within France itself. His novels, in particular, continue to sell, attracting new generations of readers. Le Nœud de Vipère, for example, has had 7 reprints in the last 10 years. Thérèse d'Esquerroux 5, and most of the others 2 or 3.
In other countries, likewise, new editions of the translations of his works have appeared, thus extending even further the circle of his readers. Meanwhile, previously unpublished works are still being published and meeting with considerable success.
Adaptations of his works are frequently appearing on radio, television and film. Le Sagouin, 1972, Le Mystère Frontenac, 1975, Le Baiser aux Lépreux, 1979, Le Nœud de Vipère and La Pharisienne, 1980. The film version of Thérèse d'Esquerroux, first presented in 1962, is still attracting large audiences in cinemas throughout the world.
It's interesting to note that during his lifetime, it was mainly in his capacity as a novelist that Mauriac attracted the attention of the critics. But since his death, other aspects of his work have attracted equal attention, notably his polemical writings. Which of the two will survive the longest, Mauriac the novelist or Mauriac the polemical writer? François Mauriac himself pondered this question. In 1969, shortly before his death, he made 2 different forecasts. One, that his block-knot would survive the longest, that is, François Mauriac the political journalist and commentator on world events and personalities. Several months later, he predicted differently, that it would be the novelist, the poet, the artist who would survive. Which will prove correct, only time will tell. But one thing is certain, François Mauriac and his work will not be forgotten, and already his place is firmly fixed among France's literary greats.